Okay, I think we'll get started. There will be some people joining, as always happens during these webinars. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to the Whiteness and Race Equality Network event for Black His Her Story Month. So just to introduce myself, my name's Akiko Hart, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Chief Exec of NSUN, which is the National Survivor User Network. NSUN is a UK charity and an England-wide membership organisation for people who live with mental ill health, distress or trauma, as well as mental health user-led groups. So 1 year on from the last meeting organised by the Whiteness and Race Equality Network, everything has changed and nothing has changed. The murder of George Floyd has brought racial justice into sharp focus. It has made the issue mainstream. In my sector, which is the charity sector, it is on most boards' agendas. Funding opportunities for charities and collectives which are led by and for people from racialized communities have opened up. They're everywhere. Initiatives such as Charity So White have gained traction and prominence, exposing the whiteness of our sector. But I also keep hearing these things take time. We need to bring people with us. We must be patient. Some of these changes are too big to happen at once. I don't know any researchers of colour. I don't know any policy workers of colour. These are the things I keep hearing. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. Tonight, we're going to be exploring co-production, whiteness, action research for race equality and mental health. We will look at the challenges, benefits, and steps needed to develop a race equality research model, an authentic co-production and equity approach to address the overrepresentation of Black people in mental health in the wake of COVID-19. First up, we have Dr. Colin King. Dr. King is lead convener of the Whiteness and Race Equality Network and the founder of BACA, the Black and Asian Coaches Association. He will be talking about the importance of a first-person Black perspective as valued epistemology, from pre-production to co-production, working across the colour line in mental health work to make Black lives matter. Colin, are you okay to go?
Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for attending this evening's session. Big thank you to Value-Based Practice, Oxford University, and particularly for Francis and Matthew for getting this underway. I think we've actually addressed the aims of tonight and what we're trying to achieve. I'm going to talk about co-production as a fallacy and a methodology, because whiteness is really made visible. I want to look at the first-person Black perspective, which is actually never valued as a true epistemology of knowledge. I want to look at this relationship between pre-production, and I think that's the period between co-production that shapes the working relationship between the colour line. And lastly, as Tita said, I want to look at, so what are the challenges, but benefits and steps needed in terms of race equality research model. Let's go to the next one, please. Last year we looked at this. It was the first year we had this research, and the first thing we wanted to define was what was whiteness. And the common response to the narrative was about power, it was about privileges, but a lot of people weren't sure about what we were actually talking about. Actually, a lot of people weren't actually asked to look at whiteness in their life. So the next question we asked, so how can it be effective in race equality work in mental health? And what lots of people began to say is that people need to make disclosures about the power they have as white people and how they enable and give access to different cultural models that may be in contradiction to their own lifestyle beliefs. But lastly, how do you then root it into the work that we do in terms of race and counselling? And one of the big things was, how do we politicize counselling? How do we enable people to have self-analysis and reflection? Let's go to the next one, please. So, one of the things that was really interesting about this is what the first workshop last year, and I think the people who are here today may be a bit embarrassed to look at themselves over the year to see how much they may have aged, was we wanted to know, so what was whiteness as a first person interpretation? Before we go any further at looking at co-production, A great deal of investment has been done looking at race and equality, but very little looks at whiteness. I'm not quite sure we can play that, Francis. Can we play the video, Francis? Obviously, I'm not sure if people can hear that. So are people hearing this?
I'm not, Colin, no.
Okay, then, so I'll interpret it what people said. Can we go back to the last slide, please? Yeah, so Niall, sorry if I'm misrepresenting you. People were connecting whiteness to their national identity, about being Irish or being Jewish. And what Anika said was really revealing about whiteness changes depending on the space you're in and who you are with and what privileges you had. So the question that got me was, maybe whiteness is a third person analysis because people really don't think about it. So if whiteness cannot be seen and it's something we see as appeared, can it have a role in co-production and equality? And if it does not declare that it has a lived world, can it see the injustice it may create in the world of research? This is a frightening indictment to begin to address co-production and whiteness before we even get into the power dynamics of race equality. So these are the big challenges that came out from last year. We can just go to the next slide, please. So what's happened? Unfortunately, sadly, we've had another death this week, Walter Wallace, who was actually murdered in the streets of America. But the changes of our last year are quite devastating. COVID-19 has really raised the value of the importance of the Black life in modern Britain. So the point is, if you're Black and you're male, you're 3 times more likely to die from the virus. But we've had some really interesting, important work done by people like Black Fives and Jackie Dyer, which is the first national project that looks at how do we advance race equality in mental health work. And this is a crucial landmark moment in which we actually begin to focus around this issue around race equality, power, and redistribution of resources. But the challenge is me that are we improving experiences or are we changing the system? What's happening, I think, is a growth of more white researchers who've involved in research around anti-racism. We need to question the motive. Is it economic? Is it political? Is it academic? Or is it really about redistribution of power? And I've also got to say, as Du Bois says about the talented 10, there's a growth of Black academics and mentors and therapists that are really engaging in this work. But the thing we need to look at is what are the models they're beginning to address that's going to help us focus on this thing called race, power, and equality. The saddest thing that's happened in the last year is the demise of the Black lived research survivors. I see very few, and I think there's a major reason about that I want to go into later. But there's been a growth of research that's not led to political change. It's led to reinforcing negative stereotypes of the Black experience, and it has excluded Black people from being actively involved in new research conventions. Can I go to the next one, please? So this is me, my white mask, and I'm a true involved in Fanon. And so I think what's really important from this whole idea about race equality in research is the first person Black experience, which is missing. We have no valid epistemology. And what I mean by that is that knowledge is used to define who we are, rather than how we use our knowledge to define the constraints and boundaries to research. And in that relationship, we have no ontological existence or worth in research unless we are diagnosed. My diagnosis is schizophrenia. That gives me a human lived reality and gives me a capital. And within that, I'm a feature of investigation, but I have no power in that investigation in terms of the outcomes, in terms of how I define. And unfortunately, The commercialization of research means I have become a capital to both Black and white researchers. And unfortunately, our death as Black people in the mental health system is our worth. My mask is my life that I leave behind, in which do not want to expose the reality of trying to coexist around white people that we may fear in terms of how they are actually researching us. You can go to the next one. But where did this actually all start? What is the historical relationship between the denial of the first person subject and the pre-production stage of white theory? And it starts with Cartwright's notion of deafomania, where it starts a process of research is about controlling the experiences, the identity, the reality, the livelihood of the Black people. And the Black first person experience becomes a eugenic, dehumanized in the educational, psychological, and scientific racism. It becomes an unconscious software in research that's really rarely examined. And in this, whiteness forms a methodological framework without equality. It translates me as the first person through methods, methodologies, analysis, and ethics of deceit. Ethics for me is a big issue for me about how ethically we are now working in a co-production relationship between whiteness and the process of power. I can just go to the next one. I'm just waiting for that 30 seconds, so please let me know. So for us to begin to address this issue around race equality is to challenge the pre-production transition. And that is to challenge the third person Eurocentric privilege, the privilege they have in their Eurocentric research models to define the other with no ethical accountability for how they racialize that. And this is taken part through Cartwright in terms of how Black people are made compliant through the period of slavery. It's racialized through the work of Jung and Freud about the uncivilized, dehumanized, and the inability to have emotions. Through Bowlby's notion of cultural attachment. And it erases itself through the educational system as well. But most importantly, I know that Bill Fulford's not here, but the philosophy of a biased whiteness is now actually reified and reinforced itself through the conventional research. And so for us, as the first person African, we need to then go back to the theories that empower us in that race equality relationship with whiteness. Theories of Fanon and the mask and the notion of us having series of consciousness. Theories that Wilson says about how we are behaviorally controlled through the research process. And also understanding symbols of whiteness that are illustrated in that co-production relationship. If you'd like to go ahead. So this is why I thought, I don't believe in co-production. I think it's a myth. And it's been a failure because it starts too late. Once you have assessed and admitted someone to the hospital, you are then no longer into co-production. And so there's a failure of co-production to deracialize the pre-production stage. And this is what's happened. We, as Black people in white research over the last 100 years, have been projected as dysfunctional through white theorists, such as Bowlby and Erickson. In education, the famous book, which is really an important book that anybody who's into psychotherapy and education research, Bernard Core, research by Galton and Jensens about the lack of educational ability of Black people to actually understand and conceptualize whiteness. But lastly, today, the challenges for us is the political systematic notion of whiteness. Whiteness is invisible, but how do we make it invisible in terms of how it dispoliticizes the Black researcher? And lastly, the major issue that fronts me as a Black person is mental health. in our diagnostic framework that resembles symbolism and array differences. In that, I'm calling out for our Black historical figures to assist us in the memory that we have a background knowledge in which we can actually compromise and negotiate in a real co-production race equality framework. And so just moving on to the last couple of slides. I'm not sure we can show this, but Steve is on next. I'm not sure if we can get a sound in this.
If you just give me a moment, I'll see if I can activate that.
Trying to understand race and mental health from a research perspective, that we, the first person in that research, is often white, and the they, the third person in the research, is black, is the research subject who we're asking questions about. So isn't any wonder why we have a failure of imagination in our research to do research that kind of identifies and empowers change. And I think there's a big responsibility on universities as institutions, but also on researchers. So me,
picking up on what Steve said, because most of my life I've been a researcher in one way or another. And one of the things that, and one of the ways I've been a researcher is in philosophy. And one of the things that I've engaged with is the philosophy of science and what makes for good science. And one of the things that I've argued for consistently and against, I should say, colleagues in white psychiatry and neuroscience research, is that we need to hang on to an idea of what's called reliability. So reliability is consistency between observers. And in a sense, you can see that's the foundation of anything we're going to. If you can't have consistent observations, where do you go? And in a way, I still think that's a good idea. But what I've picked up from Steve and from working with Colin and this group is that, of course, that very reliability, right at the very heart of what we regard as best science, immediately excludes minority voices. And if the system is predominantly white, that means it immediately excludes black voices. Yeah. So the very reliability, it's not so much that, so if white supremacy actually is embodied in the very theoretical basis on which we're trying to change things. Now, I hasten to add, the reason why I hang in with, with this group and working with Colin, despite my ignorance and continuing difficulty of understanding what it's all about, is because I think what Colin's brought to this whole discussion is something really quite novel. It is about inside, outside, and it's captured for me in the phrase getting beyond the colour bar. And of course, it doesn't mean literally the colour bar. What it means is getting beyond a black-white standoff, you know, Jewish, Aryan standoff, whatever those tribal standoffs are, and trying to find something that goes beyond that. And that's where I feel your network particularly is trying to take us. Of course, it's a very difficult route to go.
You can just go on. I'll just go. I know we haven't got very little time left, so I'll just go through these very quickly. Next slide, very quickly. Next slide. So I love this person. Her name is Joyce Ladner, who wrote the most powerful book about whiteness and methodology. And she said, if we are going to have an approach to race ecology, we must challenge race ideologies and race conventions. We need an ideology of a back methodology, but also decolonizing the research power. Just go to the next one because I know I'm running out of time. But 2 seconds. And so what I'm saying here, co-production must be an equal relationship between the black perspective and the white perspective that comes together to a transcultural co-production. I'm not going to go through this. There's a series of black writers here and a series of white writers, and how we then come to a racialized culture of equality in which leads to an outcome which is liberating black people from mental health network where they've been incarcerated since the period of slavery. And lastly, in my last slide, very quickly as I finish, was this. We were really privileged to work with black tribes, and we did this work with them. And this is what they actually came up, first persons talking about what needs to happen, a guidance for co-production and race equality. Race and research and mental health is not an academic exercise. It's a social justice issue. And what they were questioning is white researchers' lived experience to reflect on their power and how they impact on the relationship. But the ultimate thing as I finished was, what is research? And if it doesn't lead to liberation and emancipation, it's not research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Always such a joy and a privilege to hear you speak, and lots and lots there that we will be picking up, I hope, in the questions. Just to say to everyone, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom, and I will pick them up and I'll ask the panelists questions when everyone has finished speaking. Colin, before you turn your camera off, just 2 quick questions. Will the slides, your slides, be available, and is this being recorded? Oh, you're on mute.
Slides will be charged based upon how much you earn. And yes, you can have them, yeah, free of charge.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
As well, yeah.
Fantastic. And there are already some questions coming in, but I will come back to them right at the end. Okay, so next up we have Dr. Michael Bennett, who, yep, brilliant, who's moved to the panelists. Ooh, are you able to switch your camera on, Michael? Brilliant. Oh, Michael? So Dr. Bennett will be talking about Behind the Mask, demedicalising race and mental health in professional football.
No, he's not doing it. He's doing that tomorrow evening.
Oh.
It's in the programme.
Okay. Dr. Bennett, will you be, are you speaking tonight?
No, he's speaking tomorrow night.
Oh, okay. That's my mistake then. I'm really, really sorry. It was in the programme, but yeah, no worries. Okay, brilliant. So we'll have a little change of plan. My mistake. Next up, we have Professor Steve Gillard, who is Professor of Mental Health at City University, London. Hi, Steve, are you there? Brilliant. Are you good to go? Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Akiko. And thank you, Colin. I wasn't aware you were going to show that video earlier, so I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but hopefully I will be enlarging on what I said rather spontaneously a year ago. So I'm a white academic who does research about mental health. Most of my colleagues are or have been white, and that's largely what the academic institutions I've worked in look like. The Black and Asian colleagues I've worked alongside have tended either to work in service departments such as HR and IT, or in teaching, and to be in more junior roles. Very few are in senior research-focused positions. We like to think of our universities as liberal institutions, but that imbalance is striking. One of the achievements of the Black Lives Matter movement has been to highlight those institutional inequities and demand a response that is real, is practical, and not just about fine sounding, but ultimately hollow words. So that's what I'm going to try and respond to today from a personal perspective. So the starting point, there's nothing new here. Decades of policy of mental health, of attempts at engaging and changing, have failed to address racial inequities in access, experience, and outcomes of mental health care. What's been the role of mental health research in this? As researchers, many of us, me included, conscientiously collect statistics and stories about ethnicity and mental health. We might feel that we've done our duty, but basically all we succeed in doing is replicating what we already know about inequality, while failing to change or challenge the status quo. And feeling that we've done our best, we get on with the rest of our work. After all, if we do our jobs well, we can make a difference in other important areas. And so where our own lives are not directly impacted by those inequities, we're not black and mad, or at least not black, we're in the privileged position of not having to do more in order to feel like we've somehow done enough. I keep using the first person pronoun, we. When we write about race and mental health, as mental health researchers, the we that we use, as I noted at the beginning, is largely white, and the they that we write about is black or Asian or mixed, but always the third person, the other, never by definition ourselves. In our wisdom as white researchers, as white academics, from our privileged position of not having to experience the consequences of our research, we take the data we've so dutifully collected and describe, deconstruct, and reconstruct the lives of others. So I would ask, is it any surprise that our research so rarely contributes to changing the reality of people's lives, to actually addressing rather than merely reporting inequality? We, this white we, suffer from a failure of imagination in doing our research because our privilege does not require us to actually experience the inequality we investigate. We cannot imagine what it might take to make a difference because we can't actually know what the matter is in the first place. We are stuck doing ineffective third-person research about race and mental health in university departments where Black researchers, Black academics, are largely absent. So then the answer to the question, what might we do better when we do research about race and mental health, is not to collect yet more data and to become more and more astute with our intersectional analyses and to offer more pearls of wisdom about other people's lives. It has to be about changing who does research, about whom and how. It's about changing who the we, the first person, is in this conversation. And because our mental health research departments are so often largely or entirely white, that has to be about giving up control over that space. So what are the practical steps here? The Athena Swan initiative, slowly but noticeably, is making a difference to issues of gender and seniority in universities. Researchers, male researchers, took notice when they were told they wouldn't be able to access certain funding streams if they didn't get this right. There is no reason not to apply similar mechanisms around race in academia, but that's a systemic approach. What can I do as a white researcher who also exercises power through my seniority over who occupies this research space? When I begin the process of developing a research project, of writing a proposal for research funding, what happens? Believing that I know what the problem is that the research is going to address, I identify all the different sorts of expertise, academic and clinical, that I think are required to answer those research questions. Then I contact all the people I know, or ask people I know who they would recommend, and invite those people to start putting together the research proposal. And probability dictates that most, if not all, the people who go on to become the research team are white, deciding exactly how the research is done, making sense of the data, and writing up and disseminating the research through our networks. How do we address that? What we've become a bit better at recent years is inviting different sorts of expertise into those initial formative discussions about what we're researching, why and how. Through including and enabling service user and survivor voices to inform and shape our research from the outset, we are sometimes, when we do it well, doing different research as a result, research that has a more meaningful impact on people's lives. And that's because instead of us, academics and clinicians, doing research about them, people who use mental health services, those key initial decisions about what questions are to ask and how are informed, at least in part, by first-person experiential knowledge. I do better research if it isn't just up to me to decide how we're going to do the research, to imagine what other people's lives might be like, if I'm prepared to give up some control over that process. Sometimes those survivor voices are also Black voices, but that tends to be coincidental, and we don't often signal that it is the Black voice that we want to hear. And if we don't explicitly invite Black voices into that process of designing research, if we don't make it clear that we want our research to be informed by racialized experience, racialized knowledge about mental health, that we're offering a real stake in the research, why would anyone volunteer that part of our lives? If we quietly open the door of our largely white research departments just by an inch or two, who do we expect to walk in? We have to create safe, welcoming spaces, whether that is in the university or by ourselves venturing out into the community, where research can be co-owned, created and produced. We've had some degree of success with this community participatory approach, but we need to do this all the time as part of all of our research and make mistakes and work out how to get it right, to do it well. That's just the start. When we put together our research teams, we need to think about who our collaborators and experts are, who we are asking to join the team and why. This isn't just about having a Black academic look after the bit of the study that's about race. This is about the makeup of the research team as a whole, about who the we is going to be that asks and answers questions about race and mental health in the first place, about having actual first-person experience of how everyday lives are racialized, inform the way in which the research is done. So we're not left guessing and surmising and once again failing to make a difference. And when we employ our research assistants and research fellows, the people who are actually going to be doing the research, recruiting and interviewing participants, we need to think about who we're employing. After all, these people are the next generation of academics. And so this is also an opportunity to change the face of mental health research in our universities. I realize that what I'm talking about is only a very partial response to a deeply entrenched issue. As I've suggested, there are also things that can be done at a systemic institutional level. And I'm aware of arguments that even the process of giving up power is a form of exercising power, of deciding who can come in, of privilege and patronage that potentially undermines Black voices. But as a white academic, it probably isn't okay just to wait for someone else to step up and change things. This is about aspiring to something more than simply reporting, as we so often do in our research, that the proportion of Black and minority ethnic people in our sample roughly reflects the population nationally, and leaving that as the best that we can do. It's about trying to enable change in who gets to do research about race and mental health, in the hope that we, a different, more inclusive we, produce research that has a meaningful impact on people's lives. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much, and perfect timing. Some really, really powerful points there about changing the we, and thank you as well for making some really practical suggestions as well. So all things that I hope we'll pick up in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Okay, so next up we have Dr. Alison Faulkner. I'm so pleased that you're here, Alison. Alison is a survivor researcher and a trainer, and also does lots of work with NSUN, which she won't be talking about tonight, but I just wanted to put that in. Alison, are you okay to turn your camera on?
Yeah. Hi.
Sure.
Just finding my slides.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Right, is that okay now?
That's great, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me, Colin, to participate in this really interesting discussion this evening. Really fundamentally important discussion. So I'm going to say some things that will repeat some things that Steve has said, without a doubt. I was particularly taken by his sort of re-examination of who are we when we talk about the research that we do. My context is coming from a survivor researcher perspective, so I have experience of using mental health services. I am a survivor researcher. I'm going to talk about white privilege and knowledge production and the potential of survivor research, the potential of and for survivor research to make a difference, with some concluding thoughts at the end. But just to reflect on some of our overlapping sort of experiences of the world, perhaps. So I do have some experience of marginalization as well as some experience of privilege. So as a user of mental health services, I have certainly been in positions of extreme experiences of lacking in power for periods of time. And also as a lesbian, gay woman, I have also experienced marginalization in other ways. I'm not going to set myself up in any way as a sort of an expert on whiteness and on examining the research around race equality, but I am going to just talk, I guess I regard myself as a work in progress on these matters, and I'm just going to reflect on a few of those things today. first of all, thinking about what is survivor research to people who are not familiar with survivor research. It's insider research undertaken by people with some shared knowledge and experience of mental health, mental ill health. It recognizes experiential knowledge as a valuable source of evidence, first and foremost. It aims to equalize the relationship, the power relationship between the researcher and the researched. And in some people's views has the potential to transform knowledge about mental health really significantly. And we try through our work to establish service users and survivors as credible knowers and knowledge producers. But nevertheless, of course, survivor research is undertaken within a context of both powerlessness and privilege. Power and knowledge obviously operates in a variety of ways throughout our system, and in the research world in particular. What society considers to be universally true about mental health is based on the white Eurocentric knowledge of professionals and practitioners, not on the knowledge of those who live with the experience, not including knowledge from non-white cultures. So the power to identify mental illness, to name and to diagnose rests with the white professionals, largely, not exclusively white professionals and practitioners, but within that white system, as Colin referred to at the end, towards the end of his presentation. However, despite these really positive aspirations of survivor research, this is a quotation from a friend and colleague of mine, Jayashree Kalatil, in a presentation at St. George's, where Steve also was present. It seems like repeat sort of cycles of discussion. Despite talking about the need to be diverse and inclusive, survivor research is by and large a homogeneous place which reflects little of the vast array of different experiences, identities, skills, and backgrounds that constitute the larger service user survivor community. And that is undoubtedly the case. And Colin referred at some point in your presentation, Colin, to the lack now of, I think the sort of, there seem to me to be fewer Black and people of color doing research in the survivor research world. I think it's not a coincidence that this is coming at this time when we're talking about the importance of Black Lives Matter. Colin was very instrumental in making me think about the meaning of whiteness. And I've been doing a great deal more thinking, writing, reading about it since first hearing him talk about whiteness, and realizing, of course, that whiteness, and here is a quotation from Sarah Ahmed, whiteness is invisible and unmarked, the absent center against which others appear only as deviants or points of deviation. Whiteness is only invisible for those who inhabit it, or those who get so used to its inhabitants that they learn not to see it even when they are not in it. And that undoubtedly is very much an important theme. To be white means to be the reference population in research, the norm against which the other is measured, and Colin very much already addressed that issue. To be white means not having to think about your race every single day. It means going unnoticed into a room full of white people, and it opens doors to work and opportunities both within academia and elsewhere. For a freelance survivor researcher like myself, it means being offered work on a range of topics, not being selected solely for work that is about being white. It's assumed that I could take part in any research on any different subject. I am the neutral, the mainstream, one of the people who's defining the space. And this is another sort of set of, I've put a link there for people who are interested, but just thinking through in research how whiteness works. It looks for and at what is wrong with racialized communities. Again, Colin very much was speaking to that issue. It constantly places the blame for disadvantage and discrimination on the people who experience those things. Whiteness uses categorization and tick boxes to fragment people, shift them away from the white default, identifying them in more and more ways as not normal. It prizes knowledge, but only particular forms of knowledge, a narrow field of science, and turning away from epistemological positions that don't privilege itself. it encourages us to privilege certain worldviews and to dismiss others as unscientific or not evidenced. And it makes white Eurocentric assumptions about people, communities, populations of colour. So the potential, I believe, of and for survivor research, because we ought to have a shared understanding of discrimination and disadvantage to a limited extent. Can we build on that shared understanding and understand that we can share with and work with in partnership with different communities, enabling opportunities for people to make sense of their identities? I'm saying tell their stories, and I immediately hesitate there because I've taken part in 2 projects recently where I have been one of the researchers, and we are listening to people talking of their experiences, Black people, people of colour talking about their experiences. And I've worked in partnership with a Black researcher talking about the process of doing that and not wishing to use people's stories for white research is a really problematic theme, I think, and one that needs much more exploration. So survivor research creates spaces for experiential knowledge to come to the foreground, and as against privileging the dominant knowledge paradigms that are in existence, the sort of pseudoscience that we see in the psy professions. Well, we have the potential, I think, to retain an awareness of white privilege and of the voices that remain marginalized. I think Sandra Harding writes about when exploring standpoint theory, which is a particular form of theory which is quite useful in some ways. She talks of the stronger objectivity that people who are seeing the world from the margins might have, because they see things from their perspectives as well as they see the mainstream perspective that speaks from the center. So this is one of my thoughts for the future and thinking about how do we look at this. Another quotation from Jayashree Kalatil, and talking about it being an issue for all of us. So all of us who are in positions to lead research or promote survivor research within university spaces need to start acting on our commitments to equality and diversity and start asking difficult questions about how power and privilege works, how knowledge is produced, and who is involved in it. If not, survivor research will continue to represent only those of us who are already privileged in terms of our socio-cultural backgrounds and perpetuate the systems of inequality that are already in place. It's a journey that we all, I think, would like to participate in. If we are here today, this evening, then I hope that we're all of us in this, would like to be in this together. What can we do? What can we do? I mean, I think more and more it's a question of action rather than thinking, talking. It's important to listen, to think, to talk, and to read. Nevertheless, we have to become as white people, we have to become more literate and articulate about white privilege and racism, and acknowledge when our knowledge or research is essentially white and therefore partial and incomplete. And be aware of the scientific racism inherent in the side disciplines. Be very aware of that. Be prepared to question and challenge in white majority forums and debates. Make explicit the theoretical underpinnings to what we do. To work in partnership, working against othering racialized people and communities. Don't wait for Black people to come to us. Why would they? If they've already experienced racism, disadvantage, their ideas, their thoughts being dismissed, why would they come to us? Reach out and listen and have actually really workable anti-racist policies and practices in organizations. Just briefly coming back to the theoretical underpinnings, a piece of work that I did some years ago was profoundly improved and enlightened by my understanding of a group of Black survivor researchers who talked to me about looking at what are your assumptions and the theoretical underpinnings to what you're talking about. And suddenly I realized where they were misplaced. And it's important to remember in terms of thinking about action as against thinking, writing, talking. It's a privilege to educate yourself about racism. rather than experiencing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Just a brilliant, brilliant talk as ever. And love the Sarah Ahmed quote. Just to say as well, I don't know if you've looked at the participants list, but we have survivor researchers there from all around the world. So no doubt we will get questions later on as well. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Dr. Niall Boyce, who is editor of The Lancet Psychiatry, who'll be talking about addressing whiteness in psychiatric journals to improve equality in research in relation to race and mental health. Welcome, Niall, and lovely to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Colin, for again organising a great event. Now, I'm just going to pop some slides up, which will take me a moment. There we go. So you should be able to see those on your screen. And I'm just going to get into presentation mode. There we go. Okay. So as Akiko said, I'm the editor of The Lancet Psychiatry. This is a journal in the Lancet group, a journal which has been publishing, our journal's been publishing for 6 years now. The Lancet itself has been publishing for almost 200 years. And the slogan of The Lancet is the best science for better lives. And I think one of the things which I've gleaned from the presentation so far is really a rethinking of what we mean when we talk about science and what we mean when we talk about better lives. Now, I went to medical school. I was trained in medical science. But when I started getting involved in the world of mental health, I realized that that would only take you so far. That science, if we define it in a very narrow biomedical way, is not going to address the complexities of mental health. It's not going to address the complexities of the societies within which mental health problems are embedded and experienced. So what we need to do, I think, is to rethink and reinterpret this idea of the best science in terms of research, publishing, and practice. Publishing is my particular side of things. And to repeat again something which we've heard earlier, when Alison said that this issue of racism and of anti-racism, these are of fundamental importance, and they really are. So I have been interested to see over the past year how things have developed in the medical world, in the mental health world, and in the specific effect of the meeting which we had last year. So as an editor, I very much produce the end product of practice and research, but also as a journal with the sort of influence that we have, I also try to make sure that we can influence the thought processes which are going in at the other side, right at the start of the research and of the implementation into practice. Now, as an editor, my job, I think, is to set the stage, it's to light the lights, and it is then to sink backwards into well-deserved obscurity. And what I'm going to do is give you some idea of the various ways in which we have been reflecting the issues and hopefully shaping the issues and some of the plans we have going forward. And I'll be very interested to know some of your thoughts on this. So this is a comment which we published on race, mental health and the research gap, which was written by Colin. This was published in May 2019. And this was really at the start of things. This comment, I think, was absolutely fascinating in that it challenged many of the assumptions with which people go into the research and practice of mental health. And following the meeting, 2 comments so far, and a third which is on the way, have directly come out of that. The first, which I'm going to briefly mention, is this, which we published online in January. And this is by Sashi and Malik. And it's on the project involving what I think was called the Outside In project, or the Inside Outside project, which involves really genuine, meaningful co-production of mental health. The message here, very much reiterating Steve's point, that scoping exercises are all very well, but we know what the issues are, and what we need to do now is to implement. And this is really moving towards implementation. It's a great comment, very worth reading. More recently, we have published this from Michael, which focuses on mental health in the context of professional football. This is something which I'm particularly interested in because football is, I think, an immense cultural force, certainly in the UK, certainly across Europe, and is increasingly of interest as a way to initiate discussions around mental health with the public and also within the profession. This is a fantastic comment. It's done very well so far online and is also very worth a read. We have another comment by Colin and colleagues, which is on the way. And what I'm going to do now is just talk about a few other things that we have published. Now, this is something which we published in July, and this is by Jude Marie Senard, who is from Ottawa in Canada. And this was really by way of first thoughts on the provision of anti-racist mental health care. It was such a privilege to receive this comment and to publish it, because this is beginning to point out an actual actionable framework, which I'm sure will develop. But I think it was really great to be able to get this out quickly and to provide white clinicians with some food for thought and with some actual actionable points in their day-to-day practice. Across the group as a whole, the Lancet has now a dedicated page which is on the subject of racial equality. Now, if you go to this page, you can see the link at the bottom here, lancet.com/racial equality. This is a page which collects a lot of relevant material from across the Lancet's journals, and this accompanies an in-house project in which people who work at the Lancet, who are of Black and other ethnic minorities, are working together with a project to really address some of the historical and present issues around race in the Lancet. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Lancet as a journal has been publishing for 200 years. Now, of course, if you think about that time period, that really covers a point at which Britain is at its what we might call imperial and colonial height. And therefore, in an institution of this age, there is a lot of history to reflect on, and a lot of reflection on how that history will affect the current editorial perspective, the current professional perspective. And addressing this history is, of course, part of this project. And we're looking forward to seeing some of the outputs of that in later this year, hopefully, and also in 2021 and far beyond. We really are in this for the distance. So another project, which I'm just going to mention tonight, this is in the early stages, we are progressing this, is with one of our editorial board members called Ayanna Jordan. She is an assistant professor at Yale. And with Ayanna and her colleagues, we are working on a series of papers which will go into a dedicated issue around the theme of Black people's mental health in the United States of America. And this is a project which I'm really excited about. I'm working on it with our US-based editor, Dustin Graham. There are some fantastically innovative ideas, not just for the standard review style paper, but also other ways in which we can use the journal, in which we can use video and sound and really create, I hope, a substantial and hopefully influential document. Now, the final thing which I'm going to talk about is our collaboration with the Mental Elf. And despite perhaps the somewhat frivolous name, the Mental Elf, which I believe Alison has blogged for actually, is a really great site. It basically takes mental health research and it breaks it down and critiques it and helps it to be moved towards practice. Now, with the Mental Elf and with University College London, we've organized a series of events over the past few years, which are called Mental Health Question Time, the hashtag there. MHQT. Clearly, the pandemic has put paid to our in-person events, but we are coming back online. And the first event of our new online existence is on November the 18th, this year, of course, at 5:30 p.m. London time. And this has been produced in collaboration with Natalie Creary, the director of Black Thrive. And this has the title, Mental Health Research is Racist, so what are we all going to do about it? I'm going to pop the link in the chat just after I finish talking, and it would be absolutely great if as many people as possible could attend that, because I'm really fascinated to see how that discussion goes. So that gives you some idea. We are, I think, at the beginning of a journey. I think it is a long overdue journey. I'm very grateful to be taking it with your help. And again, to quote Alison, this is a work in progress. But I think that what it comes down to is, again, the subject of the best science for better lives. I think what we need to do is to almost redefine what we mean by science. And of course, the original meaning of science is simply knowledge. And therefore, I think that as an editor, I need to broaden my previous perceptions of knowledge, of science, and hopefully move towards real, substantial, sustainable, and positive change. Thank you very much for listening to me, and we'll now move to the discussion, which I'll be very interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niall. Super, super interesting, and just really interesting to think about this kind of behind the scenes work where actually so much power operates. Please, everyone, put your questions in the chat and the Q&A, and I will put them to our panelists. And if all the panelists could switch their cameras on but keep their mics off for the moment, that would be brilliant. Niall, I mean, I'm going to ask you a question because because I can. By the way, that mental health event looks absolutely brilliant. I'm just interested to know what kind of challenges you've come up against in doing this work. Because so many really, really exciting initiatives there. Has it been plain sailing?
That's an interesting question. And I have to say, one of the issues which I've come across is that when we were putting together the mental health of Black Americans series, it became clear to me what a terrible experience many Black clinicians and researchers in the States have had of publishing, of not being able to express frankly and clearly experiences which they have had, of even using the word racism. And I think that there's a substantial exercise there of, you know, really building trust and building confidence. That I think has been very, very important.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So I'm going to read out some questions. I suppose what I tend to do with these in these webinars is that I don't tend to use people's names just on the basis that I kind of presume that just erring on the side of caution, because maybe some people prefer to be anonymous. So perhaps if you could just pop in the Q&A if you're happy for me to use your name or not, that would be great. But I'm just going to err on the side of caution for the moment and not use people's names. So I've got a question for everyone. I don't know who wants to take it. Some really challenging, important things in here. What have the panelists really done or intend to do to individually, collectively, and systemically make really felt change for researchers and research participants from the global majority populations? Change the power and privilege link. It still appears to be academic discussions rather than actions. I may have got this wrong. Stop telling us it is a journey or a work in progress. It's been going on too long. Ladders for Action have been trying to engage with UKRI regards research funding, and they have found that 0% of funding has been given to Black researchers if they lead research. Who would like to take that?
Well, I can start off with an issue actually which really concerns me, which is credit being given where credit is due in terms of authorship. you know, this is a real problem which I've talked to researchers about, and that often researchers on projects which are dealing with issues of race and anti-racism will often involve junior researchers. This happens in global mental health as well, who are essentially used to collect data or to provide knowledge or resource, and then not appropriately credited when it comes to the actual paper. And this is something which I wouldn't say I'm at a loss, but it's very hard to deal with it as an editor. But I think, you know, this is something which really needs to be addressed by funders and institutions to give credit where credit is due, and to really, you know, develop careers.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to, yep, Alison?
Yes, I share that frustration very much. Certainly I've made personal commitments to do my work differently, but of course I don't have the link to funding that some people have. And I work as I am in a survivor and freelance position. But what I am doing is trying to work in partnership with Black researchers, survivor researchers where I can. And I'm trying to also, I mean, in terms of give credit where credit is due, I think one of the things that we've done in the survivor researcher world is not to realize how many Black service user survivors are out there writing and thinking in different countries. We haven't really paid attention to we've tended to be very, you know, focused on our own little white corner of the world and not realize that there's some really, you know, just powerful stuff going on in other places, you know, so it's giving credit about reading, it's reading people's writings. You know, just that is something that I think is a really vital part of it. But it is so hard to really, I mean, if I'm invited to get involved in a research project, as I have been recently, it's entirely white people about a really serious mental health issue in the services where Black people are majority, you know, are being made a majority part of the service using population. And I ask the question, you know, why are there no Black researchers in this team? And well, we couldn't find any. It's very, very, it's still very frustrating. Anyway, I share the frustration of the person who questioned, which isn't very helpful. Sorry.
Can I answer that question? I'm getting a bit frustrated because the challenge there was action research for change. And I think we do too much research at the moment. And people get engaged in getting money and getting funding and being accountable to organizations. And what has not changed is the reduction of Black people in the mental health system over the last 20 years. The number of Black people who are on Section 13A of the Mental Health Act, the number of Black people who are men who are being restrained and controlled that are dying in our mental health system. It's no longer about research, it's about taking community action and acknowledging civil rights to change positions. So I no longer want to spend my life begging white organizations for research on my community when I know blatantly what the answer is. I want to spend my time empowering young people to know their civil rights, to be accountable, to be challenging systems, to be mentoring. I do not want to spend the next 20 years watching the Waters and all the Black men and the Black community that are suffering and dying because we have spent all our time on research. Research has got to stop and money has to be popped into positive action that is going to lead to a change. Get rid of the Mental Health Act. Firstly, get rid of Section 13 of the Mental Health Act. Get rid of white commissioners. Dismantle the diagnostic framework that continues to racialize our experiences and incarcerate us into the modern prison we are criminalized. We don't need models. We know the answer. We should learn from the 60s model of civil rights, where people stood up together. And this is a time, and I think from a challenge now, that there needs to be a column that looks at positive research outcomes between whites and blacks working together. Do not spend our time pontificating about science, deconstruction, methodological analysis, what is the best, because if it doesn't lead to any outcome, it's a complete waste of fucking time. I'm sorry about being rude. We have got to move on to the next level because we have brothers and sisters that are locked up and things haven't changed. So I don't get answers to questions, but that's what I'm doing. I'm empowering my community so they can empower themselves.
Thank you, Colin. Just to say as well, Alison wrote, Colin, you are not alone. I know others who do not want to do this anymore. Steve, did you want to speak to the point as well?
Yeah, I was just thinking of one of the small things that we've tried to do things differently. In lots of research now, we would start with a lived experience advisory panel to try and improve the way we do our research. And I think what we tended to do in the past was to recruit those panels from service user groups within mental health trusts. So those were people who were already included in mental health services. So we were enabling those people to inform and shape our research. And in doing that, in a way, we were perpetuating exclusion. So we weren't inviting people into those conversations who were excluded from the research, which was the problem that the research was trying to address in the first place. So those perspectives were completely missing, and the research, in a way, is toothless as a result to change anything for those people. And I think one of the things we are trying to do now is to look beyond formal mental health institutions, beyond trusts, and to work with community sector groups to start the conversation about what needs to be researched and how, by whom, to start it in the community rather than in the university. So I mean, hopefully that's a small step in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I'm just getting another comment here in the chat for Colin. Community collective action and civil rights, empower community to enable themselves, stop racializing our mental health and incarcerating based on race. Colin King, thank you for those words. So just wanted to feed that back. Okay, I've got a very different kind of question now from Anna Bergqvist, pronouns she, her. And it is for Niall, although other people may want to speak to this as well. And it's about the revival of philosophical questioning in science and medical knowledge. Philosophy has its own serious whiteness issues, but can it also be a source of scientific progress, as seen in social epistemology, the ethics, power, sociology of knowledge and knowledge production, critical theory and theoretical ethics, for example, articulating implicit value blindness, relational moral agency, etc.?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, to that, I'd add the philosopher who I suppose has been most influential on me as Merleau-Ponty with his work on phenomenology, because I think of that as a great route into exploding assumptions, into empathy, in towards appreciation of the richness of experience. And indeed, it's been interesting to see over the past few years how phenomenology has been taken up in mental health research to immensely productive ends. So yes, I would completely agree with your point.
Brilliant, thank you. Before I move on, does anyone else want to speak to that? No?
To say that we've got to have Afrocentric philosophers' contribution as well, because without that, we're not going to have any radical change. And we must remember the seeds of eugenics have been based on white philosophers in justifying their rationale about the Black experience. Phenomenology is crucial. Margaret Bennett has probably done the most important study in race mental from a philological positioning. And I think that's true empowerment. I must say, sorry for swearing earlier on.
Thank you. And just to say, I put it in the chat, but Michael Bennett is not speaking tonight because he is speaking tomorrow, and the link is in the chat, but I'll put it up again in a moment. Okay, so now we have a question for all the panelists. In some of the discussions I've been part of in the US, the starting point is specifically a deep, intense examination of how white privilege is a reward for supporting white supremacy. The idea is that we won't begin to get it by staying on the surface of how to do, but instead white folks need to look at the prejudices we hold and how we use them for cover. The question is, how do we carry white supremacy in our bodies? Until we admit our very private, painful roles in perpetuation of white supremacy, we won't be able to shift larger terrains such as epistemic and assumptions about who holds knowledge and why and how. We face a challenge, a deep one, of self-examination of ugly truths. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I can only agree, really. I think it's a really important important step in understanding where we're at. And I oscillate, I think, between that and feeling like we need to do something. I think that at the moment I'm in this position of thinking we need to act, we need to do things. It's no good just examining our navels endlessly, you know, but both things need to happen, because we need to really fully understand how we are a part of the problem as white people, how we are a part of what, you know, we are embodying the white privilege that we're talking about here today. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Can I ask a question of, I mean, it's for Alison and Steve, but other people may want to answer this as well. And it's kind of about how do we address the overrepresentation of, you know, white survivor researchers, certainly in the UK, when it's a world which is already super marginalized, you know, in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, I think this is a really important question, and I have talked to some of my colleagues about it who are not white, and I just think we start in the wrong place quite often, in the same way that other mainstream researchers do. We're often not really starting in the right place. So I'm actually interested today to hear Colin talk about pre-production, because co-production, whoever the co-partners are in that co-production, I think it's really important to start earlier on, to make those partnerships, to build those relationships before. I mean, peer support is a theme that I work on a lot at the moment, and not very often research related, as you know, Kiko. It's more often, it's working to sort of enable peer support to happen in different ways, and just supporting it, writing things, and that is part of the issue, I think, is connecting and forming relationships of trust. That if you cannot form relationships of trust in the first place, then it's going to be pretty difficult then to do something that is really about co-production. And I do so share Colin's skepticism about co-production. So I think it's the relationships, it's the trust, it's the trying to work with people, acknowledging where you are in that relationship. And I am doing that at the moment in a small piece of work, and two pieces of work, but it's going. Oh, and the other thing is about language. I think some people are doing work that could be seen as research, but isn't using the word research in different communities. So it's acknowledging the work that is happening within communities, and working, hearing and building on that as well.
It's interesting. Yeah, I was talking to someone about how mad studies is sometimes seen as an exclusively white endeavor, which I thought was really interesting. Steve, do you want to speak to that point at all? Not the mad studies one, the survivor researcher one.
Yeah, I think there's something about the mindset of being a researcher, or a self-consciously academic researcher, if you like, which means that we don't like uncomfortable conversations. we like everyone to agree, because then we think the knowledge is reliable and it carries more weight. And I'm slightly at odds at the point that Bill made in the video earlier in that respect. And we can feel that we've done very well kind of allowing survivor voices as disruptive voices into our research conversations, and we give ourselves a pat on the back about that, because that's challenged some of our thinking already about what is good research and what is good science. Now we find ourselves expected to do it all over again, and to invite Black voices and Black thinking into those conversations. And as researchers, we're not very well disposed towards that. Our training is all about agreement. If we can all agree that this is the right way to do it, it must be good science. And everything we do is supported by the idea of peer review. So we look to each other, we look to the people who are most like us in order to give us a pat on the back and say, yes, you're doing it well. And there's a kind of an inertia there that stops us engaging with other voices, with other conversations.
But having said that, I think that if you begin to break that mold, the response is maybe more positive than you'd anticipate, Steve. So one of the things that we've been doing as a journal is we've had a sort of dedicated program for people who have not previously peer reviewed for medical journals, but who have lived experience. And, you know, there are elements of that which we would do differently if we were to start it again tomorrow. But we're now at a point where we're seeing some very positive outcomes from that. So, for instance, there's a paper which is in press at the moment, which I'm not going to go into details of for that reason. But this is one of the papers which was reviewed by one of our reviewers with lived experience, who then provided a linked comment to go with the paper. And the research team who had produced the paper were absolutely delighted by the perspective which that gave, a perspective which they genuinely would not have spotted, which would not have come up with had it not been for this interaction. So I think, yes, we can expect some degree of resistance and we can expect some uncomfortable feelings, but I think we should also bear in mind that there are really potentially great rewards for everybody if we're serious and committed and stay with it and engage with this.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was a little bit lost in the chat there. Colin, I've got this really practical question for you, which I have lost. Sorry, and it's about, could you? Oh goodness, sorry. Could you provide the name of the lady who writes on methodologies and the name of the book, please? You mentioned her in your presentation.
Yeah, it's Joyce Ladner, and she wrote a famous book called The Death of White Sociology, which is in 1973, which is a landmark book. And I think what the book is actually doing is that we too often polarize race, and we're unable to unpolarize it and come together and look at how things are racialized in the relationship between whiteness and blackness, because Black people are affected by whiteness. And I think there's a real problematic issue here when someone said about white supremacy and being embodied by white supremacy, which may be a form of conjecture or internalization when we use the notion of whiteness. And the whole idea about the whiteness network was to begin to demystify these challenges like we are doing tonight. So working with Niall and the kid was fantastic now, and Alison, over a period of time now, we are getting closer to what the possibility of working across these perceived or assumed lines of differences, but also the implication of what it does to us. And also the danger is that when we polarize white theorists, it's dangerous, because it's not the theorist, maybe it's the individual value within the theory that's being produced within science. And there may be a lot of mileage and lots of things that we can actually bring together. And that's why I'm putting a lot of pressure, like I do on Niall every time I see him, to produce a publication of weeks when we begin to address these issues on a quarterly basis. Because what I saw you doing, Niall, is talking from the Black experience, Black experience, Black experience. There comes a time when you've got to talk from a joint integrated experience, just like gender equality. You've got to have men and women talking about these issues together, because not, we're not going to actually begin to analyze how we deal with the implications of our denial. Unless we address that, we're going to continue to have the overrepresentation. This is a really important issue for what I call backstage racism from Goffman's book, where the little research, as a ASW, I sectioned over 600 Black men, and I can tell you nothing was wrong with their mental health at all. It was a systemic racism and lack of support. And I looked back over that and I thought to myself, it would have been really good as the psychiatrist and the doctor and I sat down together and shared our values that are leading to this construction in terms of overrepresentation, because that is research. Research doesn't have to be formalized and apply for funding. Research is when you do it together and you begin to understand the formulation of differences, but also the ability to collectively change the way you look at mental health and actually save Black people from this system. So I'm talking a load of crap, but going back to the book is worth an investment because it actually talks about research, real race equality research should lead to liberation and emancipation. I hope I've got the book right. If not, I'll put it up on the chat box.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Colin. Alison has actually responded to a point that, and actually it's relevant to what you just said, Colin, and the conversation Alison, Steve and Niall were just having. And obviously the focus tonight is very much on research. And I'm kind of really interested in this. So it's about peer review. And, you know, is peer review one of those fundamental structures that is hard to shake? And you're talking here in the chat, Alison, about academic structures, bureaucracy, hierarchies, and whiteness. Is peer review inherently white? Is it inherently racist? What are your views on this?
I don't know enough about all of the people involved in peer review. I don't very often write for peer-reviewed journals, but what I do have experience of is working on a piece of work that was essentially about the emotional work for researchers, survivor researchers being involved in research. I have interviewed a number of people about this, and there is a paper currently with a journal at the moment. But the important thing about that paper or that piece of work was that the issues of race and whiteness in the university structures was more powerful for the Black people we spoke to than the issues of having lived experience of mental health issues. And that was a really, really significant shift in me, hearing people talk about those issues and how walking into a room as the token Black person, because you are immediately visible as Black, whereas you can potentially hide the fact that you have lived experience if you are able to perform sane in a sane environment. It was really, it was a piece of work that I definitely shifted something for me because it was so powerful.
Okay, I can talk about peer review briefly. I mean, I think this hits at one of the issues with peer review, which is that if it's peer review, you'll inevitably be going to people, well, maybe not inevitably, but the way it's worked in the past is that it's tended to involve people who are already much published in the area, because you want an informed opinion. But the downside of this is that it can lead to a degree of conservatism in publishing, conservatism with a small c. And so I think the challenge for journal editors is how to maybe rethink peer review. So you're producing quality material, but which has maybe greater scope for innovation than has existed previously in the literature.
I've got a quick point, which is about peer review at the other end of the process. So in the decision on what gets funded and why, And that peer review is by and large a technically driven process that is value blind. It tends to be about, is the power calculation sound? Is the behavioural aspect of the proposal, does it cite a well-recognised theory? Even the qualitative work, does it cite an appropriate methodological text? And the issue of who is this research about and why, and if the research is going to challenge or perpetuate inequality, almost never comes up. So I think we need to look at the peer review at the front end of the research process as well.
Thank you so much. I can't believe this, but we're actually coming towards the end of our discussion. I'm so sorry. I feel like I've managed this badly. I feel like we've timed out, but we could still talk for another hour and a half. I just wanted to read one final comment from someone. Agree with lack of trust, faith in co-production, also with action and how things can be different. The one thing it seems to me that it is positive for people who have become co or peer researchers is that it's a stepping stone out of the mental health system. So a comment there from one of our participants. Before we end, we've got 2 minutes, and I wondered, Colin, if you would like to close this off, but also talk a little bit about the event tomorrow evening, and I will put the link in the chat so people can join you tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, before everybody shoots off, I'd just like to thank everybody that's contributed tonight. And there's something about peer group and collaboration and working across colour lines. I think that's operated tonight. There's been peer analysis and challenges as well. I also like to say, now we need a publication chapter for whiteness and race equality. So I think there's 40 people that have heard you commit yourself to doing that online tonight. We thank you all graciously from the bottom of our heart. Yeah. I also think that we should do this again in a year's time, that we should begin to analyse what individual commitments we are making towards race equality and mental health. Tomorrow night, we have a outstanding line of people from the world of sport talking about mental health. Mental health is a massive issue in sport. Unfortunately, this week we had an academy player that hung himself because he didn't get a contract. So the hidden agenda about race, sports is something that Michael will be talking about tomorrow. And also the big issue we'll be talking about is the massive impact of COVID-19 that faces the Black community, given that the highest people who are most vulnerable, and also the people that are most vulnerable in terms of socio and economically and mental health are Black communities. But I want to leave people with a sentiment about whiteness and race equality work was working across the colour line. There's people not here tonight, but I must say a big thank you to Simon, who did a lot of work for the background of this, Professor Bill Fulford, John, and I think Anna as well. We meet monthly. It's open to anyone to widen the family of peer group and begin to address these issues. But my ultimate aim is, if I'm here next year, I just hope the number of Black people in our mental health system declines. And I can then hold white people, Black people responsible for that major achievement, rather than increase research academic papers. So I thank you all. Have a good night. Thank you, Alison, 20 years. Thank you, Steve, Anika, fantastically shared. Niall, we know you got all the money, so thank you very much. I will be in contact. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.